Mediators Qatar and Pakistan say the US and Iran made progress in talks on a peace deal in Switzerland this past Sunday, with technical talks to continue this week. We have more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Monday's edition of Press Perspective. It's June 22nd here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. Sunday's meeting in Switzerland is the latest in a series of talks between the US and Iran, as well as their mediators Qatar and Pakistan, to ensure broader peace in the Middle East. For more on this, I have Celio Fioretti with French daily Croix here in the studio. Celio, welcome back.
Glad to be here.
I also have Professor Choi Hyun Jin at Kyung Hee University with us virtually. Professor Choi, it's a pleasure.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Lovely. Celia, we'll start here in the studio. Let's begin with details that have been disclosed about the latest talks between the US and Iran in Switzerland this past weekend.
Well, the most important takeaway is that talks did not collapse despite some very tense moment. In fact, the United States and Iran agreed on a roadmap aimed at reaching a final agreement within 60 days, which is probably the biggest breakthrough so far. The discussion focused on mainly three issues. First, obviously, the Strait of Hormuz. The two sides agreed to establish a direct communication line to avoid incidents and guarantee the safe passage of ships, commercial vessels through this crucial waterway. Second, on Lebanon, Washington and Tehran agreed to create what they call a de-confliction cell involving Lebanon and international mediators to monitor the ceasefire in the region and prevent fighting between Israel and the Hezbollah and to prevent more further escalation of this conflict. This is especially important because the question of Lebanon was an important point of friction between Israel, Washington, and Iran. And third, there were discussions about the broader implementation of the memorandum of understanding that was signed last week. Iran said it's already secured waivers for oil export and access to some frozen assets and the launch of a reconstruction program. But the most important thing for them is the most sensitive point is the nuclear issue. And Iran said they will not move further in the deal about nuclear issue if U.S. Do not commit, honor their promises on economic aid package to Iran. So the first mood is the mood of this first round of negotiation is cautious optimism. It's good that both parties are talking. It's progressing. Still, there's a lot of tension and a lot of critical elements still remain still unresolved.
You're right, and one of them being, of course, the nuclear issue. That being said, Professor Choi, the talks in Switzerland, they usher in 60 days of discussions with regard to Iran's nuclear ambitions. Now, some say this 60-day time frame itself is an ambitious goal. Do you agree?
Yes, I do. The 60-day is a short timeline. For example, the Obama administration spent almost 2 years negotiating a nuclear deal with Iran. So the challenge is that this talk between the two countries, not just about the Iran's nuclear program, they also cover sanction relief, the frozen Iranian asset, and the Strait of Hormuz, and the regional security issues, including Lebanon and Israel. I think the most difficult issue here is how to deal with Iran's existing enriched uranium. The two sides still need to agree on how this material will be handled and how it will be diluted and how the process will be inspected and verified. The U.S. officials suggested that this uranium could be diluted inside Iran under IAEA supervision, but many questions still remain. So, for example, how can inspectors be sure that all of the uranium has been declared? And also, how can they verify that nothing has been hidden or moved elsewhere? So that's why, as the saying goes, I think the devil is in the detail. So we could make a political agreement within 60 days, but resolving the technical and the supervision and also verification issue could take much longer. And that's why I think 60 days is a very ambitious timeline.
Right, and against that backdrop, Celia, also over the weekend, there were fresh concerns about sea traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. Could you tell us a bit about why that was the case?
Well, the concert over the weekend came after Iranian media said the Iran military had declared the Strait of Hormuz closed again, accusing Israel of violating a ceasefire, pursuing strikes against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. That immediately raised alarm, of course, because as we know now, since a couple of months, the Strait of Hormuz is a critical waterway, and economies especially in Asia, but in the whole world, are really relying on ships passing through this waterway. But the reality on the ground, despite what Iran's military were saying, was a bit different. The U.S. Central Command said the flow of ships has not been interrupted and actually increased in recent days. Washington insists that Iran currently does not have a total control over the Strait of Hormuz, and they haven't seen any military ships blocking the waterway. So at this stage, we're seeing more of a war of narrative on top of the war, the military confrontation. Iran is using clearly the Strait of Hormuz and the menace of closing the Strait of Hormuz again as a lever for a current negotiation in Switzerland, and they try to weigh in this fear of a more difficult economy in the coming months if they don't get what they want in the talks. As for Israel, its position is that the Hezbollah violated the ceasefire first, and they were just answering this attack. Israeli officials maintain that they reserve the right to continue any military operation against what they describe as a security threat to the state of Israel in Lebanon. However, there are clearly signs of friction between Washington and Israel over that part of the war, because clearly Washington wants to move on with the deal and try to make peace with Iran, but Iran will not pursue the deal if the war in Lebanon is still going on. So the bottom line for the Strait of Hormuz is that despite some narrative, so far the situations remain calm in the Strait, but it doesn't mean that it will stay calm forever if the negotiations are stalled or collapsed.
Right, and speaking about that, Professor Choi, is the current ceasefire strong enough to survive future challenges? I mean, what are the potential deal breakers?
Yeah, the ceasefire itself is certainly good news, but still I would describe the ceasefire agreement as fragile rather than stable. The first challenge is the nuclear issue. So as I said earlier, the two sides still need to agree on what to do with Iran's existing enriched uranium. So when I read the text of MOU, there are no details about how to deal with, how to remove and dilute this uranium material inside Iran. So I believe inspection and the verification issue, and this issue could become a major source of disagreement in the near future. And the second and perhaps even bigger challenge is Iran's network of regional proxy groups. So Iran is maintaining some military network with Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthi rebels in Yemen and also Hamas in Gaza Strip. However, the current agreement, the MOU, focuses mainly on the relation between the United States and Iran, but it does not fully address Iran's support for this kind of military groups in the region. And that's why the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is not happy with the current version of ceasefire. From Israel's perspective, this is a major problem. So Israel views Hezbollah as one of the major security threats on its border, and many Israelis they see Lebanon as a forward operating military base for Iran. So as long as Iran continue to provide military support to Hezbollah and other proxy groups in the region, I think Iran may be compelled to resume military operations in the future. And therefore, in that sense, Israel and Lebanon could become the potential spoilers in this peace process.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Celio, for the sake of some perspective that is, could you briefly walk us through the 14 points of the Memorandum of Understanding signed between the US and Iran?
Well, the 14 point of that first deal is built around four big pillars: security, nuclear restriction, economic, and regional stability. First, on security, both the United States and Iran agreed to an immediate permanent end to military operation, including in Lebanon, which is still kind of ongoing. They also pledged to not attack one another and to not interfere in domestic affairs. Second, on the nuclear issue, and this is, we said, the most sensitive, the more critical part of the deal, Iran reaffirmed it will not develop or acquire nuclear weapon. Existing stockpiles of enriched uranium will be dealt with international supervision. And broader question surrounding Iran's civilian nuclear program are to be negotiated further in the final agreement. Third, there is a very significant economic package. The U.S. commits to gradually lift sanctions, authorizing Iranian oil export and releasing Iranian frozen assets, and working with regional partners, but we don't know exactly how and who exactly, on a reconstruction and redevelopment package worth at least $300 billion, which is a huge amount of money for the U.S. right now. And finally, there is the regional dimension of the deal. Iran agrees to ensure a safe passage of commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, while the U.S. commits to ending its naval blockade of the strait. But now it's important to say, as we mentioned, they have 60 days to agree on that framework with the possibility of an extension if they fail to reach an agreement. But this will help to commit to a final deal that will ultimately be also endorsed by the UN Security Council. So it's quite an ambitious agreement. Some critics say it's not totally in favor of the US, but that will still have to be negotiated throughout those 60 days.
Right. Professor Choi, Celio just mentioned the 14 points of the MOU. They've triggered quite a bit of talk about which country appears to have won the US-Iran conflict. What are your thoughts?
So at this stage, I think it's too early to talk about winner and losers because there's the 14 points in the MOU. There are broad political agreements, and unfortunately, there are no much details in the current version of the MOU. So what we have now is a limited deal and not a final peace agreement. Important issues, especially Iran's nuclear program, still need to be negotiated during the next 60 days. So both sides can point to some gains. The United States, for example, secures Iran's commitment to discuss its enriched uranium and to stop nuclear activities. And also Iran, on the other hand, gained some path toward the sanction relief and some access to frozen assets, but neither side got everything they wanted. And for example, the United States didn't achieve a regime change in Iran. The Islamist regime is still in power. And also the United States failed to transfer existing uranium material out of Iran. And also Iran didn't receive immediate sanction relief from the United States. And therefore, neither side got everything it wanted. More importantly, the more difficult part may still lie ahead. The two sides must still agree on how to deal with Iran's highly enriched uranium and how this process will be verified and inspected. So if we make a judgment based on today's situation, I would say nobody has clearly won. The real test will come during the next 60 days. So only after a final agreement is made between the United States and Iran, we can make a meaningful judgment about who gained more from this deal.
All right, so a judgment perhaps after 60 days of discussions between the US and Iran. Right, then staying with security, but moving beyond the Middle East and perhaps to Europe, of course, Celio, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, he said that the US will scale back U.S. military footprint in Europe. Could you tell us a bit about this initiative?
Yes, this is probably the most significant shift in transatlantic security policy in decades, with what Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth announced is not an immediate withdrawal of U.S. forces from Europe, but rather a 6-month review of America's military posture on the old continent, Europe. The objective is clear. The Trump administration wants Europe to rely not on the U.S. anymore, but rely on its own, and to have a greater responsibility in its own defense. In practical terms, the United States plans to reduce the military asset, as it would make what NATO would make available to Europe in case of a big crisis with Russia, for example. That includes cutting roughly a third of its fighter jet contribution, along with some reconnaissance drone, strategic bombers, and naval capabilities. NATO countries are also scrambling to determine who will and who can fill those gaps. The message from Washington in that new era in which Europe has to rely on its own is that Europe should be independent, more autonomous in its own defense, and the American umbrella, sort of say, is coming to an end. And Hegseth was very explicit. He said that NATO can no longer be a one-way street. Both sides should be able to take care of themselves and work for each other, and Europe should, according to him, move fast and irreversibly for its own defense. Those implications are the implications are enormous for European continent, because many countries like Germany, like Poland, are already trying to rearm themselves, but they will have to do it much faster than they anticipated. And other countries like France or the UK also are now more thinking to take a greater role, a leading role in European defense. But they will need to have to find a consensus, and it's still hard to reach right now. Things are moving very fast with the US. So bottom line is that it's not a US exit of NATO, more of a shift in what the US are bringing to Europe. But Europe will have to adapt fast to this new era for defense.
Right, and keeping this in mind, Professor Choi, do you suppose the US's planned troop reduction in Europe is perhaps a wake-up call for US allies here in Asia, including, of course, South Korea?
Yes, I think this is kind of wake-up call, but not only for South Korea, but for many American allies in Asia and in Europe. The key issue is not simply troop numbers. What we are seeing is a change in American priorities. The Trump administration is expecting its ally to contribute more to regional security and also to support American broader strategic goal. For example, the Defense Secretary Hegseth somehow sent some warning message to his European ally, because those countries in Europe didn't really contribute to American war against Iran. So this message is especially important for South Korea, I think. So in the past, the main role of US force in South Korea was to defend South Korea and to deter North Korea. But today, however, the Washington increasingly see Korean Peninsula as a part of a wider Indo-Pacific strategy, including China and also the Taiwan Strait. In other words, the United States is asking us to do more, not only on the Korean Peninsula, but across the region. So if allies are unwilling to make a greater contribution, the Washington may reduce its military presence or shift to resources elsewhere. And that is the message from the Defense Secretary Hegseth. So this does not mean our alliance with the United States is ending, but it does mean that South Korea needs to think more seriously about what role we can play in this changing security environment of the Indo-Pacific.
Right. Celio, I'd like to extend the same question to you. What do you suppose are the broader implications of the Trump administration's shift in security priorities for allies like South Korea?
Well, I think what we're seeing these days is also a trend of more broader communication and cooperation between South Korea and Japan, for example. I think both countries understood very well that the times are shifting, and maybe it's time for also Asia to think about how they can cooperate and not only rely on the US. I can see also in the South Korean government, the president is currently trying to retrieve the OPCON, the Operational Command of Military Operations. So you can see also countries like South Korea or Japan also are ready to take on this responsibility and to face the fact that maybe they will have to take care of their own defense, maybe in greater terms, and not only rely on the US. We can clearly see that US is prioritizing China and the issue in the Taiwan Strait. Countries seems to be adapting very well. The thing is, Korea, for example, has a strong defense industry already operating for many years now, even exporting now to Europe to help this rearmament program in Europe. So country like Korea is ready. Japan is in a very much different situation, but still they're trying. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi is also trying to rearm Japan in its own way. But of course, there are some issues with foreign countries, North Korea, with China, that might not see well this new rearmament of Japan and South Korea. But for now, both governments are trying to at least work together and reassure partners in the region, especially China, that they are not a direct threat to Beijing. But we'll see how it develops in the course of maybe 5-10 years. But it is on the way, and of course, countries here should be ready in case there's a bigger shift from the US.
Right. The words of wisdom, of course, being that cooperation is always better than confrontation. Right. Then. All right, Celio, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. Professor Choi, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you very much.
Right, that ends Monday's edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.